share on 3 different topics. One was the introduction of Union Gospel to our church. In 1972, when I had cancer and had to spend a lot of time in Winnipeg, I was exposed to Union Gospel. We went to a ladies' meeting there, and I was pretty thrilled with this idea of helping people that are needy. Then some of us went to a ladies' aid meeting. I believe Tina Friesen, Pastor Friesen's wife, Helen Dell, and we enjoyed that. So the next step was we went to a banquet in Winnipeg. Harry and Bernice, Henry and Tina, I think, quite a few of us. Our quartet got to sing eventually in Winnipeg at a banquet, in Steinbach at a banquet, in Winkler at a banquet. So some of us couples decided we would like to have a banquet in Gladstone, and together with Marge and Martin Penner and Henry and Tina and Bill and myself, and I'm not quite sure who was all involved, but we got together and had contact with Peter Dick, who thought it was a great idea. We printed tickets. The first year we had the bakery bake the potatoes. We bought chicken from the Chinese restaurant, and we made desserts and vegetables, and we had our first Union Gospel banquet. Over the years, it was much too large of a task for just a couple of people to do, so we asked the missions committee to take it over, and at first it was a year by year, well, we'll see if we'll do it, we'll try again, but now this has become a program of our church, and every fall we have a Union Gospel banquet. Another area that I was involved in when this new church was first built in Gladstone, I thought we should have an outreach to children. And so some of the teenagers, Linda and Marlene Friesen, Sharon Gertson, some of them helped me, and we had a girls' club for grade 5 and 6 girls. The next year we thought we should also involve the boys, so quite a lot of the men and other women became involved in this Boys and Girls Club at our church. We used Child Evangelism Fellowship material plus some a girls' club material. I can't remember the name of it now. I didn't think I had to write it down. And we had a really good group of kids. We did memory work. We had a lot of crafts. We did Bible lessons. And most of the kids that came were not from our church. In fact, we stipulated that preferably they not be, because we didn't have enough room for all the children that were here. The following year, the way that this whole began was I had this idea, and I went to see Pastor Friesen, and I said, do you think the church would okay this? And it took a long time, and finally Pastor Friesen said to me, when you have a good idea, you can't wait on other people to get on board, just go ahead and do it. But 2 years after the larger group was meeting here, the church family wasn't too keen to have the mess in the building once a week. And because our material was from Child Evangelism Fellowship, I had called into Winnipeg to see if we could use this material. And McGregor had just instituted religious instruction in the schools, so David Chapman came out and met with myself and Pastor Friesen. We then went to meet Mr. Keating at the United Church and decided that we would try to go for religious instruction in the schools. I then called Mr. Ed Sklar, the principal of the elementary school, and told him what we were planning to do, and we were able to organize, and to this very day we have religious instruction in the schools here. And I must say that just to kind of say some of the things that were really interesting to me, I had the grade 7 and 8 class, and I know ever since David Chapman left CEF we've never had a 7 and 8 class. The first year almost all the grade 7 and 8s were enrolled in it, and there was no curriculum that Child Evangelism Fellowship has, so I got the kids to write a whole bunch of questions on a piece of paper and hand the papers in to me, and sort of made up a curriculum from that. And Ed Sklar used to come and sit in our class very regularly just to monitor and make sure that what we were teaching was non-denominational and would therefore meet the standards because it was not an approved curriculum. Then Mr. Chapman, David Chapman, suggested we use NavaPress, and we had little booklets on how I can become a Christian, 6 lessons that I could make go all year long. And I know some of you that are here were in those classes, like Clifford Giesbrecht and some of you. Some of the rest of you too, I think, even some of the Schellenberg girls. And the third area that I was going to touch on was that we had, as a church, sponsored a refugee family from the country of Laos. And I know there are many of the rest of you that were much more involved in having that family move to our community. But I volunteered to teach them English, and so because of that, I exposed my family to them too. And we spent a lot of time together with this family. I used to teach them for an hour every day. And they came to visit us out in the farm. And in fact, we have visited with them in Edmonton. And they treated us very beautifully to 2 huge banquets, Chinese banquets. And like Denny said, teacher, you tell us to try, you try. So we tried lots of different food and different things like that. I guess also the young people in this church have always been very meaningful to me. Some of you were there for me when I had cancer. Some of you were babysitters. Angela has just said, Mom, I met my babysitters here. But Marlene and Linda Friesen and some of the rest of you. And even today I want to say that it's the young people in this church that are really meaningful to me and have really been there for me. Thank you.
Hi there. Welcome to the program today. Have you ever looked around the community and wondered, why does this business or why do these things stay around for so long? I've pondered that question a number of times, and it goes back to history. This evening, our guest is Mr. Jacob Friesen, one of the founding ministers of the Gladstone Christian Fellowship, formerly Gladstone Mennonite Church, and we'll be discussing how the church began to the point where it is today. We'll start off going back to 1937. How did the church come about, or how did the need for a church in the Gladstone area come about?
Well, for the most part, these people that came from Saskatchewan to Manitoba in the latter 30s and early 40s were, at least the adults, had very little English schooling. And consequently, they did not assimilate or integrate with the churches that were already in existence. So they, as soon as more people came in, they started together and eventually planned and built this church for the simple reason that they would feel more comfortable in their own environment, and also because of the language would be German, and they could understand that better.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This period took approximately 10 years from the time that they first organized some meetings in houses, I understand, and then till the time the first church was built. Could you tell us how the first church was built, what kind of materials came about, and where you got them from, and those kind of things?
Well, in 1946, there was planning already underway to begin this church, because enough had moved in to make it possible to have a fair-sized congregation. Then in 1947, the building began. It was simply as cheaply as possible. They had borrowed some money from a general conference in the American States, and they then bought a livery barn in Austin that was no longer in use, tore it down and moved the lumber, and of course something new lumber was added, and that's how the church, from that material, the church was built.
Mm-hmm. Way back then it was all manual labor, all the
manual
gravel that
labor.
hauled in,
Oh,
all
yes.
the cement mixed by hand, everything was...
No, they had a little tractor on a cement mixer.
Oh, they did, eh?
Yeah, yeah. So, But
Okay.
the rest, like pouring it into wheelbarrows and carting it over to the foundation, that's all was handling. Yeah.
I understand from talking with other people who were involved there that the gravel was first shoveled onto the trucks and then
Yeah.
brought down, and
Incidentally, they hired a master carpenter who got $3 a day for his work.
$3 a day.
Yep.
That's not much compared to nowadays.
Not really, no.
Okay. After the church was built, all that organizing and stuff, what about the leadership? What kind of leadership came about?
At the same time that these people came to the Mayfelt, Arden area, a group came to the McCreary country area. And with that group came an ordained minister by the name of Reverend Jacob Logan. Although that group disbanded very soon because of poor land, etc., then Mr. Logan moved first to Arden, and from there he served Gladstone and McGregor infrequently. But in 1949 he moved to Gladstone and became the leading pastor there. I should also mention that another minister had also come along with this group from Saskatchewan by the name of Reverend A.C. Funk. And he also was part of the leadership. So these two pastors, Funk and Logan, headed up or gave leadership to this group here in Gladstone.
Okay. Moving on, further on in the years then, I guess it's needed that some Sunday school material come about. Sunday school was introduced in the years 1952 to 1957, someplace in there. Could you tell us how that came about and how that was received?
Well, since I wasn't here before 57, I have very little information, and the records didn't give much more, but there is the odd mention in one of the minutes about teachers being elected, and also some of the money that was divided between the various missions and so on. But they started also DVBS in 1945.
Okay.
And they got some men in from Altona and Winkler during the years that conducted these DVBS, these schools and so forth. So the material was, except for the adult class, which was German, came from the General Conference in the States. The other classes had scripture press material. We also at one time dabbled a bit with Rod and Steph material. But we couldn't get along with that kind of stuff. It was actually too conservative for us even.
Okay. It's interesting that you mentioned DVBS because we still continue that on
That's right.
this very day. Okay. Well, something else that would be of interest in those years was the election of the deacons. Maybe you could just share with us what the role of a deacon is and how that all came about.
Well, this happened in 1952. Abe Schellenberg was elected deacon of the church. Well, the role of the deacon was generally helping, a sort of a helpmeet for the pastor. He would, and also to look more for the, after the widows and poor people and stuff like that. But by and large, he was sort of an assistant to the pastor.
Okay. I was reading in the history book something about an overseer committee. What?
Well, here again, I am not too well informed because the records don't give any information as to what the specific work of this committee was to be, except that there was a committee. But when I came back here in 1957, it wasn't functioning at all. There wasn't, as you know, there were probably some difficulties in the church, and the whole thing had sort of come to a standstill.
Okay. You mentioned 1957. There was some new leadership came to that church. Was that yourself?
That was myself, yes.
Okay. Where had you come from before coming to Gladstone area?
I was elected in the in the McGregor Birchall Church as pastor.
Okay.
And I lived in that area for a couple of years, and then we moved up to Gladstone here.
It was during this time as well that you got some evangelistic meetings going?
Yes. We had the following year, that was 58, we had evangelistic services with Mr. Friesen, John D. Friesen from Saskatchewan, the evangelist.
Okay.
And we began with at McGregor first, where we had 10 days in a tent, and then we moved the tent to Gladstone, and had another attending the evangelic services. Now, mind you, I must say it was a very radical step to take because that was unheard of in those days, but we pulled it off, I thought, quite well.
Was it well received?
Yes, probably more because of curiosity than anything else, but yes, it was a good thing to do, yeah. There were a lot of people that had a great big blessing out of it. I should also mention that the church had, over the years, 1 week in winter, they would have pastors come in from different churches and hold meetings with a definite evangelic flavor. That happened every year.
Okay. 1958 to 1961. There seemed to be somewhat of a difficult start in that time, especially with regards to working together with the McGregor Church, especially with the catechism classes.
Well, Mr. Lowen, who was this is a different Mr. Lowen, was a pastor at McGregor Church. He had a very severe heart attack, and he had to, of course, that left the church leader us. But the church was a fairly strong church at that time, and so I was asked to help along there, especially in the spring when it came to catechism classes, which made it very difficult for me because I had the church here to attend to, and then every Sunday for 3 months in a row I would go down to McGregor and help there. So it was, to put it lightly, very difficult. Yeah.
There was also some other difficulties with regards to the Gladstone Church, and I understand there were some men from the Gladstone Church that went around in the community and talked to different people as to how they thought the church would if the church would even work, or if they would be committed to it, and I understand some men went around and did visiting people and doing that.
Well, that was Reverend Funk and myself.
Okay.
And because the church had sort of almost disintegrated in a sense because of difficulties in the church, so Mr. Funk and myself, we decided to find out who actually would want to continue having a church. And we visited every person that at least at one time attended to Gladstone Church to find out what exactly their thinking was or their attitude was concerning the church, because we had to start somewhere. And we thought that was maybe one way of starting to find out what we did have to work with.
Okay. Some other things that might have brought about some difficulty for some people anyways, with regards to some traditions and things like that, were the transition from German services over to English. How did all that fit together?
Well, when I came here, first of all, I preached in High German, because that was what I was used to. But I recognized soon enough that this just didn't go over because most of these people couldn't understand High German.
Okay.
So we switched to Low German, and even that was a stopgap affair, because even some of the younger kids were no longer familiar with Low German either. And when one of the local lads that was attended our church married an English-speaking girl, and they wanted to attend a church, then of course the decision was made to switch over to English, and that's what we did. And I must, to this day, feel grateful for the congregation to accept it just like that. No problem.
Okay. From 1962 to 1964, there were some other things that were happening. Traditionally, I guess the Mennonite people were actually very male-oriented and things like that. It was during this period of time that the inclusion of women at membership meetings and things like that took place.
When you read the minutes of the former years, that you always use the word brotherhood. But like you mentioned, that the women started to come to meetings, and we encouraged them because they were certainly a good part of the church and doing a lot of the work in it. And so already in 1962, a woman was elected to a program committee, which was unheard of. But this one steadily progressed, and until 1966, we made it official that the women would be able to vote at a membership meeting.
Now, we've talked about all these struggles that the early church worked through. This resulted in not only church growth, but also community growth around it. Did the church grow dramatically at that time, or was it a slow process?
It was around 62 and 63 that we received an influx from people from southern Manitoba. Mennonite people, and they attended our church, and they were good quality people too. And of course, that gave the boost a tremendous. They gave the church a tremendous boost. I should add, however, that because of the problems that the church experienced in the past, those members that remained were a little bit shy and get involved again. So it made it a little difficult to get going. But when these new people came in, which hadn't gone through this hassle, they didn't have these inhibitions. And so the work progressed quite well from then on.
Now, the growing of the church, I guess it got full to one point, and there was some talk of relocating that church then at that time, after the growth like that, eh?
Yes, it was in 1962 at a membership meeting that I made this suggestion, and everybody thought I was hallucinating. A little group like we, with no resource whatsoever to think of relocating or building a church, were unthinkable.
That continued church growth meant that there was more work to do.
Exactly.
And then you also brought about the idea of electing another deacon to help serving in.
Yeah, I should maybe also add that because the church was getting fuller, the Sunday school facilities were totally inadequate. This already raised questions: where do we go from here? We couldn't remain in the present building, and thinking of building another church at the present site, that was to most of it unthinkable.
Okay. You mentioned to us earlier that the Sunday school material was brought from outside.
Yep.
It wasn't something that was derived from within the congregation. It was brought in that someone else had prepared and planned, and as a guideline, I guess, eh?
Well, since I wasn't here from the very start, I can't say too much about it, except that as I said, when I arrived, there was the German for the adult class in the scripture class. Whoever initiated that, I'm not aware of. No.
Okay. In the years of 1965 to 1968, some people that are still in our community here, the D.D. Dells, they moved from Carmen, I understand, and it didn't take too long, and they were involved in the deacon ministry in the church.
We didn't have a deacon, and so of course this was a gift from God. I thought, at least that's the way I looked at it. He saw we needed one, and the Dells moved in, and we immediately, of course, put them to work. Yeah, we were very, very pleased and grateful for that. Yeah.
Okay. There's also talk in the history book of some training taking place for Sunday school teachers to better equip them, I suppose.
Yes. Sunday school, it was a bit of a deplorable situation because willing and eager as some of these teachers were, they had very, very little of any training for it. And in 1966, it was Pastor Martins, who was then the Sunday school superintendent, initiated the first Sunday school teacher training program in our church. And he got a professor from CMBC, Helmut Harder, who came in and instructed, and it was a very worthwhile thing. And later on, it was almost an annual event that teachers would train at some kind of conference, you know. So it was a pretty good step that we took there.
Was that something that the Gladstone church just did, or did other churches in the area come involved with that as well?
No, sad to say we couldn't get anyone involved. We did it on our own.
Okay. There's another difficulty, I guess, regarding some of the church function. And I guess some of the constitutions stipulated that only the bishop could baptize and serve communion. And I understand this posed a problem. Maybe for some of us, we're not quite sure what a bishop was or what the role of a bishop was. Could you explain that and then tell us about the problem?
Well, the bishop was, in a sense, the highest position in the church.
Okay.
He was he's very influential, powerful position. He almost in a sort of dictator type of thing. Mind you, it was a benevolent type of dictatorship, if it was one. Yes, and that was the rule of the church, that only the bishop could baptize people and serve at communion tables. Now, as you can see with a bishop living in Altona, that could present a problem. He had 18 other locals to attend and to serve. And we would sometimes have baptismal candidates ready a month in advance before they were baptized. And this created a problem. These were young people that had jobs waiting for them, and they couldn't stay around all the time. So it was a bit of a good problem, a big problem.
How did the church work through that problem?
Well, as you know, well, I was eventually elected a bishop too, but that didn't last very long because the General Bushford Church disintegrated, it disbanded, and each local became autonomous, and with that came also the shift in having the leading minister do the baptizing and the Holy Communion service.
Okay. Not only has society in general changed with regards to the inclusion of women in voting, but the church did as well. And it was during these years that the question came about, should the women be allowed to vote at membership meetings? First it was them just being there, and now giving them the right to vote. How did that all come about?
Well, as I mentioned before, we thought it was ridiculous because they were full-fledged members and intelligent enough to make some very good decisions and have some good input, not to allow them to vote. We thought that wasn't quite fair. So we simply moved and passed that the women would be able to vote. And no, that was a radical step for us to take, because in the General Bushford Church, no women were allowed to vote. But we were noted for being radical, and we sort of lived up to the reputation.
Okay. Now, something that just didn't stay quiet was the discussion again about the Gladstone group moving to town, possibly.
Yeah. Everybody knew something had to be done because the church was totally inadequate as far as the building was concerned. But where do we go from here? Were we as a little group of people with limited resources able to do much of anything? But we kept talking about it, and then in 5 years, that would be in 67, we first voted on a move. But at that time, although we squeaked through with a slim majority, we put it on the back burner because we needed total commitment.
Okay.
And another 5 years went by before it actually became a 100% vote, and then we proceeded from there. I should mention, however, that we at the same time tried to, at one time, investigated the possibility of sharing with the Anglican church in town here.
Right.
Because that church was used very sparingly, and we thought we might be able to share that, and also the expenses we're getting for that little too much. But because of the Sunday school department in that church, or the facilities were very inadequate, and so we shelved that idea and eventually voted to build a new church in Gladstone.
Okay. In the years of 1968 to 71, there's mention made that the ladies group developed and really got active. What sort of things did they start with, or what did they do?
Well, and then those days there was a lot of quilting to be done.
Okay.
The ladies did a lot of quilting. And of course they served at meals, for instance, Thanksgiving meal and weddings and funerals. That was their main occupation. They had some other little things, but that was the main work that they did.
Okay. 1972, I guess, the new church, the first one in town here.
Yeah.
How did that all come about? I understand that's got quite a story behind it as well.
Well, you know, looking back on it, I must say, how we ever dared to do that, I don't know, but we were so convinced this had to be done. This was the will of God, and we had to move. And so we just stepped out in faith and started to investigate the lots in town, what was available and what it all would cost and what kind of a building we'd want and so forth and so on. Oh, it was a lot of agonizing and planning in those days. Yes, that's true. Yeah.
We've heard comments more than once, the unique shape that first church in town was.
Yes.
Maybe tell us a little bit about that.
I think we were intrigued with the design, more or less. Common sense should have treated us differently, but...
Was that the ideas of a young engineer or something?
Well, I guess so, yeah. Yeah, he made a small model of it, and we liked it, you know. Actually, it was very functional as far as that goes, but it limited the idea of building onto it was impossible, in a sense. But otherwise, we liked the shape and the thing. And being, again, a bit
little bit
unusual,
radical.
yeah.
Okay. One of the highlights of 1973 was the official move of the people from the church out in the country that's along Bear Creek Road, the former site, to town. And the first service in the new church in town here, when was that? And what kind of a service, what kind of atmosphere was it?
Well, we had actually planned on having Thanksgiving service as the first service in our church, but we usually have guest speakers for that fair. But since they thought it was best that their ministers should preach the first service in that church, we decided to move one Sunday sooner. And so we moved on August the 7th, 1973. We had the first service in that church. And then the following Sunday, which would be the 14th, we had Thanksgiving service. And let me tell you, that was a Thanksgiving service. Everybody was so gung-ho, you know, and so much had been accomplished, which the impossible had become the possible, and that made us really, really grateful for that, yeah. And then, of course, on the following Sunday after that, on the 21st, we had dedication service. And we had every nook and cranny cram full of people just to see what was going on.
Good. Okay. 1974, there's a number of events that took place in our community in which the church was involved with. First one was a crusade. Who brought that?
They had been, in McGregor, Austin area, had several crusades that had been over the years been held, and we thought we should try one here in Gladstone. However, again, we were limited in the help that we could get. Only the Arden Church was willing to help us. But we did. We went ahead with plans, and we contacted Ken Campbell, the evangelist, and he held these services. And again, it was a very, very unique experience for Gladstone as a whole, because things like this hadn't been done here at all, as far as I know. And it was, I think, a very good venture. I think a lot of people got a good exposure to the gospel. Ken's a tremendous speaker, as far as that goes. And I think it was a very worthwhile thing, yeah.
Okay. Another thing that happened was Third Crossing Manor was built during that year.
Yes, and with that came the idea that of having an area ministerial. Mr. D. Cook was the first executive director of the care home. I should say the Rep 7 Regions, yes. And he was a very religious person, and he believed that a person to be fully and wholly served, there was a spiritual side to the person that had to be addressed to. And so he organized, or at least motivated, the pastors in this area to organize into a ministerial, and that's what we did. And so we served the church, the care home, as well as the hospital on a regular basis. Each church would take its turn, and months at a time, and so on and so forth. Yeah, it was at first a very worthwhile experience. Sad to say, later on, some of the people, they weren't all that enthusiastic about the ministerial being part of their program, and it sort of petered out in a sense. I think there's still somewhat going, but only to organize who holds meetings or who holds serves where, and so on and so forth. That's all.
Okay. 1975, the people were, like you said, gung-ho to go, and there was some outreach taken north to the town of Glenella. Can you tell us about that? What kind of things were done, and maybe some reasons behind that?
Well, actually, via the grapevine, we heard that certain persons in the Glenella area had expressed the desire that they would like to see a church started in Glenella. And since we were so overly active and optimistic about everything, so we thought we'd give it a try. And so we started with having once a month a Sunday evening service. And this continued for 7 years. In the meantime, however, there was a move from some people that we should start a regular church in Glenella. We didn't want to do that. We encouraged them to start a church, and we would help them with it. We believed if we went and did it for them, they wouldn't feel as responsible if they did it themselves, and
Okay.
consequently the thing could disintegrate. So it didn't ever materialize to a church, but we held service there for 7 years. And one of the reasons it petered out was these services were held in the community hall, and that could be rented for $10 or $15 a night. But then they got a grant from the government, and they expanded that hall and made it more activities in that, including serving drinks and so forth. And then the rent went up to $40. And of course the people therefore thought they couldn't afford it, although we offered to help with the expenses, but they didn't want that, so eventually it petered out.
Mm-hmm. Okay. 1976-77, Corny Martins was elected as an assistant pastor. The workload was too heavy for one man to...
It was more or less a thing for the future.
Okay.
Because as we all do, I was getting older, and eventually I would have to step back and couldn't do it. And the work was increasing dramatically too. And Pastor Martins really had the qualification, at least the way I looked at it, and that he could become a tremendous helper, and he was too. Yes, and then that, of course, when we first approached the congregation with the idea, it wasn't very well received because they couldn't see the value of having two pastors and even later on more deacons. But eventually they accepted the idea and they voted for that procedure to follow, and we did. And we were very happy that we did that too. Yeah.
That's understandable that, you know, you weren't full-time in the office. You still had your own livelihood, your own farms or whatever to take care of, and limited time to spend in nurturing the church and things like that. So more help would always be welcome.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. 1979 is interesting in that the boat people were sponsored by the church. Where were these people from?
From Taiwan.
Taiwan?
Pardon me, no. Where that war was.
Vietnam?
Vietnam, that's
Vietnam?
the one.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Well, sad to say, you see, in the fall of 1979, in November, that's when they came, I left for Mexico. I had about a 6 months leave of absence from the church to pastor a church on an interim basis in Mexico. And so they came just as I left, and when I came back 6 months later, they were on the way moving already, so I can't tell you much about it.
Okay. Okay. I know that during their time here, they did learn some English. I believe it was Janet Tykers that spent a lot of time with them, trying to teach them, English.
One of the big reasons for their move away from here to Edmonton was because there was no work for them here.
Okay.
And also Edmonton was already a community of these people.
More of their culture.
And it was a good move for them.
Now you mentioned that you took a leave of absence for 6 months to pastor the church in Mexico. Who was in leadership during that time in the Gladstone church here then?
Pastor Martins.
Pastor Martins?
Yeah.
Okay. 1980-81, your 6 months in Mexico were up and you returned back. Can you tell us maybe a little bit what you did in Mexico there?
Well, it was among the Mennonite people there, and it was again a church that had gone through difficult times and was barely functioning. So I tried during that time to bring about some reorganization and see if I could involve more people. There were many people that needed a church and were not involved. See if I could involve them in church and so on and so on. We also had a school there, and I even was a superintendent of the school. So it's kind of ironic that a person like this education I have been a superintendent, but that's what I was. It was a very challenging work, especially in the face of a lot of opposition. The old colony church was very much opposed to any other churches there, and yet there were so many people that were without churches. It was a very challenging work. Of course, the language was Low German, which I was quite familiar with, was no problem. It was a very good experience for us, yes.
Okay. We've heard from others that when you come back from a sort of a missions excursion, it's maybe a little bit different or difficult to get back into the Canadian routine. Did you find that at all? Or maybe that wasn't 6 months, maybe wasn't long enough to...
Well, that's right. But it did feel a little strange at first, because they were saying things and doing things which I hadn't been part of. And so, yeah, it was a little, but it went pretty good.
Okay. Then, during those years as well, there was the election of another deacon couple, which was Henry and Eliap. What kind of an impact did they bring to the leadership of the church?
A very, very much appreciated one. Henry was very gifted in many areas. He was, especially in the area of counseling. And he had a good gift with young people, and he was young people's leader for a while. So they made a very definite positive impact in the church.
Okay. It was also during this time that Pastor Corny Martins, assumed the leading role of the church.
It was in 1982. I had been now 25 years sort of leading minister of this church, and I thought it was time for me to step back. I realized that the way the church was growing, that it needed more than I could give them. That maybe at the present time it would have been sufficient, but looking into the future, I was totally inadequate for me to. I wasn't equipped to deal with all the problems and difficulties that did arise and issues that had to be dealt with. And so I resigned in '82 from the leadership, although I remained in the ministerial.
Were you actively participating in organizing and giving leadership in the church, or had you kind of just taken a different role?
The first couple of years I was just as busy as I had been before, because as you mentioned before, we were all pastors we had to work for our living, and Pastor Martins had to do the same thing, and so a lot of the work still fell to me, especially visitation work that I did for him.
Okay. That brings us to the next topic of, there was more discussion of adding more people, more laborers to the ministerial staff. What was the ministerial thinking at bringing that to the membership?
Well, primarily that we were looking more to the future, because I already was on the way out, and Pastor Martins could not accept the leadership on a total basis, on a part-time basis, and this made it almost necessary to have more men and people to help us do the work that was being done. And I always maintained that my vision was that if we have the people that qualify for this type of work, then we should put them into positions where they could use the talent that they have.
Okay.
And we've been tremendously blessed by that. We've served so many churches. We've served in Minnesota, we've served in Austin, we've served in Amaranth, and you name it, we've been everywhere, serving because we had surplus workers. It was a tremendous thing that we did. Yeah.
This idea of bringing more workers must have been well received, because in the following year, 1983, the church elected Pastor Randy Fehr and Henry Up as lay ministers. How did that all come about? Was that well received then, or was it
Yes.
a learning process to do that then?
No, by this time the congregation had sort of accepted the fact that we would be doing this on an almost continuous basis. Randy had, of course, his education to get. He was not available for the first couple of years all that much, and Henry had his work here at the Third Crossing Manor. He was sort of psychologist, I think it was. So actually, the time that they could give the church was very limited, but it was much appreciated whatever they did give you. So, so again, this was sort of a future type of thing.
Okay. Those weren't the only workers that were brought in. There was also the election of David and Irma Bueller, my parents, and Corny and Ann Wolf as deacon couples as well. Their role of a deacon, again, was to help out in areas that they could, and I assume that they're fulfilling their roles even now, eh?
Yeah, very, very good men, in my opinion, and they do a tremendous amount of work. there is always so much work that nobody ever sees or knows that there is. And somehow there are always people that somehow, as they use the term, fall through the cracks. And those people have to be looked after especially, and these men do a good job on that, yeah.
Now, it's been a number of years since the church was in town here, and I understand that a new building project was talked about in these years. Either the addition to the church that was there, or building a new one. Was there a need for more room?
Yes, we were full. Especially the Sunday school facilities were overly strained. We had already utilized every crack and nook that we could find to put a class in. It just wasn't sufficient anymore. And so we started to talk about building or adding on to the church. And because, as I said before already, the design of the church was not conducive to building on. And so this created tremendous problems. How do we build on, or if we build on at all? And since this kept dragging on, and the need was becoming crucial, so we built a hut about 20, 40 by 50 or something like that, which provided 5 more classrooms, which of course eased the crunch a little bit. But it wasn't a complete answer. We needed better facilities all around. Yeah.
There was some discussion as to how they could accommodate this, and there was even talk of making a sister church in the area or in different areas, as well as maybe going to a couple services a Sunday. That never really panned out. No, I think one idea was expressed because we have a certain amount of people come from Plumas. Why not build a church in Plumas? But it was never followed up. People generally didn't appreciate it at all. Okay. The years of 1984 to 1985, we see the extension of Pastor Martin's term as leading minister. For approximately how long would that have been? Or what was the church's custom?
I think when he first accepted the leadership, it was for 1 year, for a sort of a trial experience. And then it was for 2 more years, extended 2 more years. But then problems, Pastor Martin had some personal problems, which he thought he couldn't deal well with as leading minister, and so he eventually said he would have to resign from that position.
Okay, yeah. Okay, that leads us moving on to 1986, 1987. Like you said, the workload was continually growing with a growing church, and then it's quite obvious that not all the needs are being met by all the people. So there was some discussion about what could work better, and one of the topics that came up was, well, possibly a full-time, paid, salaried pastor who would spend time in the office as well as being in charge. This was something totally new again for this church.
Yes, it was becoming ever more evident we needed a full-time pastor who would spend X number of hours in the church, in the office there, and talk to people if they came and whatever their needs would be. And although we asked, tried to have Pastor Martin's, asked him if he would take it on, but he could not. He said he could not do that. So others were asked. Randy was asked, but he was still in school, so he couldn't take it on. And Eliap said he didn't think he could handle it. So there we were without a leading pastor. It was a bit of a difficult situation at that time.
So in the year following, 1988 to 1990, during that period of time, there was a shared leadership time. How?
Well, I first took it on for another year.
Okay.
But I stipulated that if a leading pastor would be available before my year was up, that he should be installed immediately. I didn't want to be leader. I had resigned because I didn't qualify anymore, I thought, and here to take it on again was for me unthinkable. But there was nobody else, so I took it on. But the year came to an end, and still nobody was there. So, of course, we had to do something, and then we had this idea about shared leadership. Each one of us, myself, Pastor Martin, and Rennie Fehr, took on a 4-month stint of leadership Well, that was not a very good deal, but it was the only one we had.
Okay. Now, as we see the church continue growing, initially way back there was some more talk of continued building a new church, and we see that during these years that came up again. And that's just interesting to see how periods of time, how long it can take for something to start in the seed stage before it comes to reality. And that's kind of interesting. That's all for this part. I'd like to thank you for joining me here and sharing about this. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll have our current pastor, Pastor Randy Fehr, sharing with us. Hi, welcome back. Our next guest is current pastor of the Gladstone Christian Fellowship, Randy Fehr. Welcome to the program. In 1989, you were, can we say, a rookie fresh out of Bible college, and you were assuming the role of leading minister. And just get your thoughts on that, a young person coming and taking on such a big responsibility.
Yeah. Well, if I can go back a little bit further, Dale, I will. I started off as a lay pastor in Gladstone Mennonite Church at that time in about 1982, 1983. And at that time I was really a rookie. Starting into ministry when you're still in your own early 20s in a congregation of people that you know, all of them, and they know you very well, can be intimidating at times. But it was a really good experience. And the church helped me in a sense in my training in the years of Bible college. However, after I graduated Bible college, it was like you said, there was a couple of years before I started in the church, but in '89, when I started in Gladstone officially, it was a little bit like jumping into something totally new and not knowing exactly where you were going to go with it first. For example, I was the first minister to be hired in a completely full-time manner. And so there was nothing to look back to in the past and say, well, this is how it was done before. I'll just pick those things up. A lot of the things I needed to look at for myself and decide how they're going to be done. And with absolutely no experience, it was interesting at the start.
Okay. It wasn't always easy, I don't imagine, because of some of the circumstances that were coming about at that time. But there was some unhappiness with the conference, so to speak, and so the initial steps were taken at that time to research other conferences and organizations, associations that our church could join that would be more in line with the doctrine as well as some goals. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah. Well, one of the projects, and this was more of an academic project that I took on almost as soon as I started as a pastor in the church, was to begin looking at the whole question of our conference affiliation. Because at this point in time, in 1989, we were, in name only, affiliated with the General Conference of Mennonites and the Manitoba Conference of Mennonites. And there was a lot of unhappiness with the way the situation was at that time, because even though we were affiliated, we weren't involved at all. And so the first step in our whole process of evaluating our conference affiliation and where we were going to go was to just evaluate the conferences we were presently with. And so the church gave me what was a one-year project of evaluating all the mail that was sent out by the conferences, evaluating it in some of the areas that you talked about, Dale, of the whole question of doctrine. Where are the conferences hitting in the areas of doctrine? And also in the area of missions and that. What are they involved in and where are they hitting for the future? So I looked at those things, and after a year, I started in November one year, and then in November the following year I made a presentation to the church. And it didn't really take off at that point in time. I think it needed some time. A lot of ideas need time to grow in a church before they take off, especially in our church. Our church has a form of government that's congregationally based. In other words, there's no decisions made from the top and then, in a sense, pushed down. The decisions are made by the congregation, and that means sometimes things move a lot more slowly. But things did get started at that point.
Okay, you've told us the reason why these things had to come about, and maybe just tell us or you told us the process as well. Who exactly did your research during that time?
Okay, as I mentioned, the first study involved just the conferences that we were presently a part of at that time. But the next step in the process was then to look at some other conferences. We weren't really happy with where we were, so we thought, well, let's broaden our vision and let's look at some conferences that are out there that we might want to be a part of. And so some of them that we evaluated were the Evangelical Free Church Conference, the Associated Gospel Churches, also two other Mennonite conferences, the Evangelical Mennonite Church Conference and the Evangelical Mennonite Mission Conference. Those were the key ones that we evaluated. There were some other ones that we looked at, but those were the ones that saw the most detailed evaluation done.
Okay. The years of 1991 and 92, we've talked previously with Mr. Friesen about the process of getting started to build another church because the one that wasn't adequate. This project was finally underway. It was a little bit behind schedule, but it did get underway. Who were the workers and how did that...
Okay, that's an interesting subject. When the work finally did begin, Corny Wolf was the general contractor, and he had two fairly capable hired men with him. One was Dale, and the other one was Daryl Tykert. And the rest of the work, other than what Corny subcontracted out to different people like Tom Ferguson and others, the rest of the work was done by volunteers. And it made for very interesting work at times.
Yeah.
I know the rafters, for example, involved heights. And for those of us who found ourselves at the top of the church, it was a good experience, but also one where I think you go back and find some nail prints and stuff in the rafters.
Yes, no doubt. I made sure I wasn't very high up there. Okay. How was the church paid for?
The church was paid for by the donations of the people. We started, by the time we actually started the church building, and that was one of the advantages of it taking so long to start, that a good amount of the money that had already come in by the time we started. And we didn't have enough to complete the whole total project when we begun. But once the project began, what can I say? Once the ball got rolling, then when people see a project starting to happen, the funds started to come in a lot more. And I have to say that as the whole process went along, we were never really stopped by a lack of funds. That things kept going along. There were some projects that we looked at and said, well, these aren't essential. We can operate in the facility without them being completed. So they would be left to the last. And there are some of those, for example, the flooring in the basement that have just been finished in the last year. So,
speaking of rafters, it was when the rafters were first up, we were blessed with a storm, and the rafters all came down. Maybe just tell us a little bit about that and what the whole mood of that was the next morning when the workers came.
Yeah, it was the day of putting the rafters up, the first time, if I can refer to it that way, was actually a good time, really enjoyed by all. But by the time we were coming to the end of the building, we already had a lot of wind picking up. And we braced the rafters as well as we could, tied them up and nailed as many cross braces as we thought would be needed. And we would have liked to do some sheeting on the roof at that time to give it some extra strength, but it was just too windy to work up there. And so it was left till morning, and to the next morning, and we really thought we had that braced well enough to stand the wind that was there. However, I think there was more than a few of the men that woke up during the night when the wind really started to howl, and had that sinking feeling in our stomachs that, is it really going to stand through that wind? And I'm not sure who was the first one onto the yard in the morning, but I remember myself coming from the west down the Bernard Road, Dennis Bernard's Road, and seeing that something wasn't right. Even from a distance, half a mile away, you could see the rafters had caved in. And when I got there, I remember Corny Wolf and some other men looking around, and the mood at that point in time wasn't that good. It's hard to look at something that you had finished to a certain point and see it all in shambles, and it did look like a big mess right at that time.
Yeah, that was a good thing for insurance, because we were able to clean that up and start afresh, and it went a lot better the second time around.
Yeah.
October 18th of 92 was the first service in the new church that stands on the corner at this time. It's a Thanksgiving service. Tell us about that service and the whole atmosphere at that time.
It was an exciting day for us. You know, I remember the week before, at that point in time, we didn't even have pews or anything in the church, chairs or anything like that. And so a bunch of guys got together one evening and started carrying pews over from the old church to the new one. And the preparations just to get things ready so that we could have a service in there. We invited a guest speaker in for that morning, and I remember the special feeling that was for all of us, because here's a project we've been talking about for more than 10 years. And now finally being able to see it come to completion. And those last couple of years in the old church had been, they've been really good, but as far as the room went, it was really tough. I remember one fellow who came to our church for the first time in 1989, the Thanksgiving service of that year. And Thanksgiving always tended to fill the building up right to the back. And his comment was he came in the back door, and he was or in the front from the doors, and he was instantly in the service because we would set chairs up till we got right to the back door, and he was right there, nowhere else to go. So it was quite the experience for them. But to be able to now, after having all that come into this new building and enjoy those facilities was a really encouraging time for everybody.
Good.
Yeah.
We've talked previously about the difficulties that the church worked through to come to where it is today. Another thing that could have been somewhat of a difficulty was that a name change issue came about.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, the name change issue, that is one of a number of things. The last, if I can say, the last 8-9 years has seen a lot of change in our church. And the question of a name change was something that originally came up when we were discussing our conference affiliation. The thought that was expressed was, well, if we're going to change a conference and leave the Mennonite conferences, then perhaps we also need to look at changing our name. Now, like anything else, a name can also have sentimental value. And the first time the question of changing the name actually came to a vote, at that time it was defeated. We had set a majority. I'm trying to remember if it was 2/3 of a majority that we required to move ahead with the changing of the name. And the vote, when it was finally taken, was about a point or 2 points below the majority needed to make a change. And so the congregation at that time felt it would be just mature and wise to leave the issue for a while.
Okay. As a growing church, we learned earlier that more workers are always needed, and this was the case in these years as well. And it was during that time that Daryl Tykert was elected as a pastor in training. What was the church's thought what could happen during this time?
Okay, it's like you said, Dale, there was a need recognized for more workers. Some of the fellows who had served our church faithfully for many years weren't getting younger. They were looking at reducing their roles and their involvement in the leadership of the church. And so there was a very obvious need inside the congregation to call more workers, to get more people involved. And we had a number of good people available to serve. And through an election process, Darrell was actually eventually called. Now, the thought with calling Darrell to serve as a pastor was to give him a 3-year term where Darrell could experience what ministry would be all about, and then to be able to decide for himself at that point in time, after having experienced it, if this is something he would want to continue it.
Mm-hmm.
And if he did, then it would be something that the church could pursue further at that time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It was also during this time that Don and Leona Peters were elected as a deacon couple, just to help out and serve in the capacities that they're so well gifted for. Okay. In May of 1993, the dedication of the new church building, from the first service about 5 months later or 6 months later, the dedication service. Tell us a little bit about that service.
Okay, it was, how can I start? It was a really special day for us, in that, special in more ways than one. Special for starters in the fact that this is the second time this congregation had been able to do this in 20 years. It had only been about 20 years since the previous church had been dedicated. Special in a way that we had been able to see over the years how the Lord had blessed us with growth numerically as well as spiritually. And special in the way that we had been able to work together as a congregation to accomplish what, when we had first looked at it, was a tremendously big project. You know, we looked at it sometimes and said, how can we do this? And with the Lord's help, we've been able to move through it. The service itself, for myself, was a really a special experience. Just to be able to look at the congregation and see how the Lord had worked in many people's lives. You know, you sometimes look at the building and you see the building as it's the end product of the project.
Right.
But the building is really there only to serve the people, and it's a facility is what it is. And yet at the same time, it's an important part of the whole picture. And to be thankful for what we were able to do was really special.
Okay. Now, you had been a pastor for a few years now. You had gotten the feel of what it was like, and you probably had reasons for tendering your resignation at that time. So that led us to the process of needing more laborers. What kind of took place at that time?
Okay. I think Dale, correct me here. Keeping years straight sometimes is hard. I think it was 1993, November, I tendered my resignation.
That could be.
Okay, and it was something that I had struggled with for a long time. The years from 1990 to 1993 were good years for me, but at the same time they were really tough years. 1990 especially was probably the toughest of the bunch. We had our first son during that year. Donovan was born, as you know and many people know, 3 months prematurely, and so there were some real health handicaps for himself, which added a lot of stress to a lifestyle as a pastor that involves a lot of being away from home. And that was only one factor amongst many that, in my own situation, led to what I can only term as burnout. And you know, to look back on it in retrospect, how I look at it is my work in the church had been very important to me, and yet in some ways I hadn't handled the pressures of it properly, and I had allowed something that was very important to become something I was doing in my own strength, and to do that it just doesn't work. And it eventually led to the point where in 1993 I realized I needed to step away for a while and take a break. And that's what we did.
Okay. Pastoral search. This had never been done in this church before. This is something new.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about how this came, or what happened when we had to finally look for a pastor?
Yeah. A very interesting experience. Like you said, Dale, as a church we had never done this before. We had always had people there that, in a sense, the torch could be passed on to. And at this time, that was not a task that Daryl felt ready for. And so we were left with the predicament of having to look outside our own congregation for a leading pastor. And we were a little bit like a fellow out on his first date. You're not sure exactly what you're doing and what's the right thing to say and so on. And so we had to do some looking around, looking for help in this whole process. And one of the people who was very helpful and just guiding us along a little bit was John Ginter with the Associated Gospel Churches. Just gave us some ideas. And also in the process gave us some referrals of people to candidate. We had to develop a system where, okay, what kind of criteria are we going to use to decide who's the right person and who isn't? We had to decide, okay, what kind of salary can we afford to pay? And what can we provide for housing and many other things, which never had been issues before because the people we had always serving were right from here in Gladstone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that search, the initial search, proved unsuccessful.
Mm-hmm.
And just going to back up just a little bit. During this time, it was also that the final decision was being made as to which conference or which association our church would join.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about how that all came about? Okay.
It actually came, when it eventually came down to a vote, it came across quite well. As I've already talked a little bit about the process that we used. And the process was very detailed and very drawn out. At one point in time, we had all these different conferences send us representatives who could do a presentation and tell us about themselves. And then we had the opportunity then, as a congregation, this was always an open congregational meeting, to be able to ask questions relating to doctrine, to missions, vision. What kind of vision did the conference have? Financial commitments and so on. And after having done all these interviews and everything else, we were able then to summarize it all and then be able to say to the people, okay, can we now make a decision on what we want to do? And eventually a vote was taken in which the decision, first of all, was unanimous to leave the conferences that we had been a part of. And then secondly, the decision was then made through a couple of votes to join the Associated Gospel Churches.
Okay. Who are the Associated Gospel Churches?
They're a group of about 140 churches that are spread all across Canada. They're actually, and it's kind of an ironical thing that we chose to join the conference with the least number of churches in Manitoba. When we joined the Associated Gospel Churches, they only had 6 churches in Manitoba. They're a conference with a philosophy that allows a lot of local church autonomy, which is what we were used to. They also have a statement of faith that in our modern society would be considered probably fundamental and evangelical. And that was something that we were looking for and felt very comfortable with their stance. We were also very impressed and thought we could learn an awful lot from them when it came to missions and evangelism and making the church relevant for society today.
Okay, and it was November of '94 that the formal service was that we were accepted into the AGC. Okay, that's interesting. Some of the things aside from church function now, it was during this time, the end of 1994, I believe, that the old church, the original one, was finally moved to Souris. And that's got an interesting story behind it as well. Could you share that with us?
Yeah, it's again is a long story. There was a congregation in Souris, a Baptist congregation, that were looking for a new facility. And without going into too many details, they eventually heard of the availability of our building. And we were looking for something that we could do with this building. It was only 20 years old, was a good, sound building, and the thought of tearing it down was just about unthinkable. And so when news came to us of a group that might be able to put it to use so that its function would continue as a church building, we were excited about that. And the detail that then needed to be worked out was how to get it from Gladstone to Souris. Now, the first efforts to try and arrange something, a mover who could do it, were unsuccessful. The biggest handicap that came was the size of the building and the height of the building, and to be able to find a route to Souris that would not interrupt too many power lines and so on. But eventually there was a mover, Anderson Movers, who were willing to take on the project. Now, the actual move was delayed a number of times, but eventually the time came where they got the building up on blocks and got it headed down the road.
Yeah.
And we were able to see it go.
Quite the sight to see,
Yeah.
the whole highway being taken up by
Yeah.
this big building coming.
The neat thing for us as a congregation was to be able to go a little bit more than a year ago to Souris and be a part of a dedication service for that building. They had renovated it and built onto it, added a large education wing, and for us to be able to go there and in a sense walk into familiar surroundings but in a whole different community was exciting and a real special time.
Okay. Like we had mentioned, the church's search for a pastor to come and fill that void had proved unsuccessful. And you had a year off or so that you had some time to evaluate certain things going on in your life. And you were approached as to reassuming the leadership role in the church. And you took that on at that time then.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It was probably, I'm not sure exactly where to start here, Dale, but it was a big step for me in that in 1993 when I had resigned, I had basically given up. I had thought, I'm not cut out for this kind of work. It's too tough. And however, having a summer off, almost a whole year off, and an opportunity to do some good physical work, try and keep up to Corny Wolf for a summer, helped me to lose 20 pounds and to get back into shape a little bit. It also, in a sense, renewed my perspective and it gave me a desire to give it another shot. And when the congregation gave me the opportunity in the fall of that year to reconsider getting involved again in full-time ministry, Debbie and I really gave it some serious thought and some prayerful thought, and decided that if we were going to try ministry again, the best place for us to try it would be here in Gladstone, where we could do it amongst friends and in a community where we were familiar with. And so we did. And we did it with a lot of soul searching. And for myself, the biggest question was, okay, the last time I burnt myself out doing this, and what do I need to do as a pastor and as a Christian? Because you know, I believe the Lord can give us the grace and the strength for whatever He asks us to do, providing we're smart enough to rely on Him for that strength, and to make sure that I did just that, trusted in Him, and did my work on that basis. So,
yeah, that tells me what the church thought of you as an individual and as a family, that they wanted you back in that leadership position. A while back we mentioned that the name change, that issue was defeated. It surfaced again at this time. And over a period of time, a vote was held, and this time it passed. And a series of events took place of selecting a new name, and the current name is Gladstone Christian Fellowship. Could you tell us why the church decided to change its name and why they chose the one they did?
Okay. The first time we began to discuss the name change happened when we started to look at being affiliated with a different conference. The second time the name change came up, it was because we were reviewing and revising our constitution as a church. And it was at that point that as we looked at the very first page of our constitution, which stated the name of the congregation shall be the Gladstone Mennonite Church. We said to ourselves, okay, if we're going to discuss this, the time to do it is now. And so at that time we began to evaluate it. Now the question for ourselves, whenever you change something, as you mentioned, Dale, is the question why? Why change it? And one of the key reasons why we as a congregation decided to change the name was because the name Mennonite tended to be too exclusive. Sometimes people might come into a community and say, well, there's a Mennonite church. That's for Mennonites. And that's not how we want it to be perceived. A church is for Christians, regardless of race or whatever. If you believe in Jesus Christ as your Savior, you're a part of that church already. We want it to be a place that people could feel comfortable fellowshipping regardless of what their background was, ethnically or whatever. And so that was one of the key reasons why we began looking at changing the name. Now we realize that a name in itself doesn't necessarily change that much, but we hoped it could be something on our part that would say, yeah, we want to be here with our doors open, in a sense, and our mind open to welcoming people of whatever background they are.
Mm-hmm. Okay. 1997 brings us to 50 years of the church in existence. 1947 was the first building, and 10 years previous, to that, people had been meeting in homes and things like that. So 50 years, looking back, God's been faithful. What kind of goals or how does the church look towards the future?
Yeah, that's interesting, Dale. If you'd asked me that question a year ago, I might have answered it totally differently. However, for myself, the last year has been a time to, in a sense, broaden my vision of the potential for the church and where we need to be going. And I think when we think of our role in society, I believe, first of all, that the church does have a very important role to fulfill. I think many people look at the church as irrelevant. It's somewhere they go to get married and buried and maybe have a Thanksgiving supper or two, where the church is relevant. The gospel, when the apostles of Jesus Christ first began to preach it, was a message of good news. That's literally the meaning of the word gospel. And I believe that message is still relevant for today. In society, there's a lot of things that we can do to change people's behavior. But I think what Jesus Christ can do is change people's hearts and make them new from the inside. Sometimes we can try and do a lot of things to change ourselves, and they can be positive and really good. But I'm reminded of a story right from the Bible itself, where Jesus was talking to a man who was as morally upright and religious as anyone could be. And Jesus said to him, he said, "Nicodemus, you need to be born again." There's a change that Jesus can bring to people's lives when they trust in him as their Savior. And I think the Bible and the gospel is relevant for today. I think the church needs to get back on the front lines of meeting the needs that are out there. I think the church needs to get back on the front lines of helping people build families that are solid and that can be lasting, and homes where children are really loved and taught what's right, what's wrong, and can grow up to become really productive, contributing people in society. This is a topic I could go on and on, Dale. Maybe I better quit before I get carried away.
Okay, good. The church will progress in the future, Lord willing. 50 years of service. That's remarkable. We talked earlier of what makes something in the community stay for so long, whether it's business, nature, or the church. And it's the people joining together, and the faithfulness and the commitment makes something last and last and last.
When people look at the church sometimes, and when people look at society, they see everything bad in it all the time. I see a lot of good things. I see, for example, in the young people that I have a chance to be a part of. So much potential, and so many kids serious about doing more than just living a life that involves serving themselves, but also they want to help other people. And that's exciting to see. It's exciting to see the things that young people are doing. I think we got a lot to look forward to in the future.
Thank you very much for participating and sharing your thoughts, and just want to say thank you once again.
Yep, thanks for the opportunity.
Yep.